Hi, I'm Adam Porter, and this is the second instalment of my new video series, Ruining Game Night, which is a series of videos where I take a bunch of different possible scenarios, some of them provided by you, the viewers, and I shuffle them up into a deck of cards. I reveal a scenario, I roll a dice to see how many players I've got, and then I choose a great game to play in that situation. But more than that, I also come up with a game which is going to ruin game night. Okay, a game that is the worst possible game to play in that scenario and guaranteed to upset that group of players. So here's my deck of cards. I'm going to shuffle them up. These have all got different scenarios on the back. Some of them written by me, some of them written by the various viewers who watched that first video. And then I've got my die here from Rolling Realms. This is probably the biggest, fanciest die that I own. I got in lots of trouble last time for using the word dice as a singular, so we'll be sticking with die as long as I remember today. And the next thing we're going to do is deal 10 cards off the top of the deck, which are going to be the cards we're going to be using in this video. So I've got my 10 scenarios, I've got my die, so let's kick off with the first scenario. And the first one is an economic game. So we've got a bunch of players who love economic games. Maybe they're a bunch of accountants or something like that. And how many players have we got? We got 6 players. So a 6-player economic game. Well, I think in my previous video I talked about Power Grid, and that would be a really good example here, but because I've already used that example, let's try and think of something else. We could play something really massive, like a really big 18xx type game. That would be very economic. So my preference for that would be to play Poseidon. Does it play with 6 players though? Where is it? It's up here somewhere. Let me check the box. Poseidon caps out at 5. So I'm racking my brains with this because everything economic that I really love seems to cap out at 5 players. So whether that's Haben Gut or the Rich and the Good, I think is the new English title for that. That's a classic old game, caps out at 5. Automobile by Martin Wallace, I really like that, but again, doesn't play with 6. Modern Art, that doesn't play with 6. So I mean, we could go really simple with something like For Sale. That's a very simple card game with a lot of auctions. It's all based around auctions. So I suppose that is an economic game. That plays really well with 6. But I suspect if a group really liked economic games, they want to get their teeth into something a little bit more substantial than that, I would probably go for Speculation as a stock market game. I don't think Stockpile plays with 6. Yeah, probably Speculation would be the way that I would go. But I don't know how good it is with 6. Maybe it would be fine. Maybe it would be fine. I'd probably tend towards playing it slightly fewer. So that would be my choice. Well, to be honest, let's go Power Grid. Let's stick with Power Grid. That's my honest choice, is 6-player game, economic, we'll go Power Grid. If we wanted something that would ruin game night, an economic game with 6 players that would ruin game night. Do you know what? I can't think of anything worse than playing a 6-player 18xx game. Oh my word, that would take... I mean, it takes hours and hours and hours to play those games, and they're fascinating. They're really good games, but why do they have to be so long? I can't imagine how long it would take. So I think that would probably ruin game night, bringing out something. I don't know the name of all these 18xx games. I only know 1830, and frankly, I played that with 2 players once, and we gave up after about 7 hours, I think. So next up then is, well, the scenario is before 1995. So we're looking for a game to play. We're in the year, I don't know, 1994. So we're looking for a 3-player game that we want to play, and it's before 1995. So I can't play anything from, you know, like Catan onwards, nothing like that. What would be a good 3-player game before 1995? I went to university in 1996, so if I think back to the sort of games that I was playing before I went to university, something with 3 players, because I probably would have played stuff like Blood Bowl and stuff like that. That's 2-player only. I think it's quite a hard task, that, 3 players before 1995. We could look at some of our modern classics. Surely some of them have been around before 1995. What about something like Modern Art? You know, was that before 1995? I'd need to look that up. I'm not sure. I don't think I can rely on that one. Oh, do you know what? I'll tell you what I'd go for before 1995. I'd go for Scotland Yard. Absolutely loved Scotland Yard as a kid, still love it now. Really good with 3 players. You'd have 1 player as Mr. X, you'd have 2 players as the detectives working together to try and catch him. That would work really, really well with 3 players before 1995. What would a game that would ruin game night before 1995? Well, you could pick most of them, frankly. Let's stick something like Game of Life on the table, you know, if you want to play that with 3 players. Most games before 1995, not all, there's some good ones, but most games before 1995 would ruin game night if you tried to play them today. It's 2 scenarios down. Next one then is, this one is from a viewer called Chris, and he said, we're still waiting for a player to arrive. So how many players do we have? We've got 6 players and we're still waiting for a player to arrive. God, what are we going to play? We're waiting for a player. We're going to be playing something with 7 players. And we've got to find something quick to play with 6 players, I guess, until that person turns up. You could play something like Happy Salmon. That would be really quick. It works really well with 6 players. I mean, that's over in 2 minutes, isn't it? They could turn up at any time. You could play it over and over again. You might have a game of Doodle Rush in there as well. Very similar concept. Plays really well with 6 players in 6 minutes. And no one's going to care if you stop halfway. I should say Doodle Rush is one of my own designs, so I'm always promoting that one. So those would be good options. What would be a terrible option that would ruin game night? You're waiting for a player to arrive, some really long game. I'll tell you what, if you got stuck into a game of Flux, Flux plays with up to 6 players, and it might only take you a couple of minutes to play, but the rules keep changing and the end game conditions keep changing, and it can go on and on and on. So you could easily fall into the trap of thinking, right, I've got 10 minutes or 15 minutes before this player's going to come. We've got 6 players, let's have a quick game of Flux. And you might get it in there in that 15 minutes, or you might still be playing an hour later. So next up then, the group, they don't speak your language. And again, we're playing with 6 people who don't speak the same language. Whew, what do we do there? I mean, you might go with something like, I might go with something like a dexterity game. Games which I think are obvious to how you play, you know, you can just learn it just like that. Speed cups would be a great example. So in speed cups, you've got a bunch of different plastic cups. You turn over a card, it's got an image on it, and the colours are laid out in a specific sequence. You've got to rearrange your cups faster than the other players to meet that sequence, hit the bell in the middle of the table. You can learn that game without even speaking. It's obvious what you're supposed to do. There's a similar game to speed cups called Ring-a-Ding. You could do it with dexterity games like Bandu, something like that would work quite well. I don't know if you could play it with 6, it would depend on how many pieces you've got. I think it plays up to 6, Bandu. If you wanted to ruin game night for people who don't speak the same language, well then it's fairly obvious, isn't it? Something with lots and lots of text in it. Or even something that requires lots of communication between the players, lots of talking between the players. I think something like Mysterium would fall apart if they didn't speak the language, and that's odd, isn't it? Because it isn't a game that has any text in it. In Mysterium, there's one player who plays the ghost, and they reveal cards. They can't speak to the other players. It's a cooperative game. The ghost is revealing images, and the other players have to try and guess what the ghost is telling them about a murder, like what the weapon was, what the location was, who did it. But the other players are all working together, discussing before they decide on their answers, and it would be a really dull game if you played it without speaking to each other. Okay, now that's odd because it should be a game that would be really good if people didn't speak the same language because there's no text, so you don't have to read anything, but actually I think it would be terrible. So next up then is At a Funeral Reception, and this was suggested by Arno, and we're playing with 4 players. So we've just had a funeral, we're at the wake, and we want to play a board game. I think we're going to have to assume that the person who's died really loves board games and they would really approve of it. Otherwise, I don't think I'll be playing a board game at a funeral, at a wake. So we're assuming that the person who died was a gamer, and maybe their partner and their family, they're gamers too, right? So we're not offending too many people. That said, we don't want to upset the aunts and uncles and the other people who are grieving who may not understand that we're playing a board game. So what we're really looking for, I think, if we're going to do this at all, okay, what we're looking for is something very discreet, okay, something I can play very subtly in a corner where nobody's even going to necessarily notice unless they're looking for it. What about something like Quicks? It's, you know, tiny little package. Roll them right. You've got your little sheet of paper. You can easily keep that hidden, right? You're rolling dice, so you've got to keep that quiet. We'd need to have a soft surface or something like that. But other than that, you're not really talking to each other. You can keep it nice and quiet. I think Quicks would be a really good option there. What would ruin game night, and in this case, of course, we're talking about ruining the funeral wake. The aforementioned Happy Salmon would be the worst possible option. Running around, shouting, high-fiving and fist-bumping. Frankly, any game is probably not a good game in this scenario, but thank you, Arno, for the suggestion. Next up then is somewhere, the opposite. Okay, so this is from Rachel, and this is a game where it's very noisy, and we're playing with 6 players. Lots of 6-player games coming up. I wish I rolled like this when I play games normally. Okay. So maybe again, this is a game where we don't want to be talking to each other, right? Because we're not going to hear each other. It's going to get on our nerves. Something frantic, I'd go Magic Maze. So Magic Maze is a game, a cooperative game. You're not allowed to speak to each other and you're playing against the time. So it's very frantic and you can get really sort of cross because the other players aren't doing what you want them to do, but you're not allowed to tell them. The only way you're able to communicate is by tapping this wooden token to say, look, I need you to do something. But they've got to work out what you want them to do. So I think that would be a great option for somewhere very, very noisy. 6-player game for somewhere very noisy where it really wouldn't work, where we'd ruin game night. It's got to be something which, you know, you've really got to think about. You know, maybe you're talking to each other, you really need to concentrate. Do you know, let's go Wingspan, all right? I think Wingspan with the expansion, you can play it with up to 6 players, maybe even more, right? I think it's a terrible idea. There's not that much interaction, and the game gets longer with each player that you add, and, you know, you're waiting for it to come around to your turn, and your turns are fun, but they're not that fascinating that you're going to wait for ages for it. I love Wingspan as a 2-player game or a 3-player game. I wouldn't want to play it with 6, and I certainly wouldn't want to play it with 6 players in a really noisy environment. Okay, so the players really want table presence. They really like table presence, okay? And, okay, so we're looking for a 1-player game with lots and lots of table presence. A solo game with table presence. That's an interesting challenge. Solo game with table presence. Do you know what? I would play solo the smart games, right? These are not really board games, okay? These are puzzles, but they're beautiful puzzles. So beautifully made. And they've got so much table presence, but essentially you're going through a series of challenges that are all laid out in a book, you know, so for example in the game, I think Jump In, you've got to get rabbits jumping over mushrooms to get them into holes, and they're all laid out, the board is laid out in different positions depending on which difficulty level you're playing at. But there's loads of these different games where you've got to achieve different things, all single player with loads of table presence. What would be a terrible game for a solo player who likes a lot of table presence? I'm thinking something like Decathlon by Rainer Knizia. Decathlon is a print and play game by Rainer Knizia, a dice game, sort of a Yahtzee type game, but you've got all sorts of different ways you've got to roll the dice in order to attempt to beat personal bests in different, you know, decathlon events, like different athletic events. Nice little game, no table presence because you're just printing it off on a sheet of paper. 1 player has broken both their wrists, and this one comes from Rachel again, and we're looking for a game with 3 players. So we've got 2 players who have got their hands functioning normally, and we've got 1 player who's got no hands. Probably best we go with something cooperative, isn't it? Yeah, I would think, because then the 3rd player with the broken wrists, they could, you know, they could join in with the decision making, but maybe not have to actually move the pieces. So you could go with something like Forbidden Island. Maybe I'd go with something like that, keep it simple. What would ruin game night? Well, it's got to be a dexterity game, hasn't it? Something like Flick of Faith. They're going to have a pretty tough time playing Flick of Faith, which is a brilliant little flicking game with 2 broken wrists. Next up, teenagers who are buzzing from energy drinks. And this one is adapted from a suggestion by Psychic Lord. So thank you, Psychic Lord. And we're looking for 3 players. We've got 3 teenagers buzzing from energy drinks. So they're feeling a bit manic. We don't want to be playing anything too thoughtful here, do we? We want to be playing something a little bit more chaotic, a little bit more crazy. Do you know? Turns out Doodle Rush and Happy Salmon are so versatile. So many different scenarios they work for. So I can't use those again. So let's go with something else. Teenagers buzzing from energy drinks. I should have a game for this. I'm sure I have a game for this. Do you know what? We could go with Anomia here. Anomia would be really good. It's hilarious. Or Big Bazar, you could play my game, Big Bazar, very similar to Anomia actually, but it's just got loads of pictures. But in both these games, you're turning over cards, and then if they match each other, the colour or the symbol matches, then you've got to call something out relating to the other card before the other player does. So there's kind of a race element, but the thing you're calling out, you've got to get the words out right. So you might have to call out like a flavour of ice cream, or in Big Bazar, you might have to make the noise of the animal that you've turned over. But so you've got to think of that before the other player thinks of their thing, and you've got to shout it out before them. You're falling over yourself trying to get your words out, and everybody's laughing. It's really frantic, chaotic. That would be a great game for a bunch of teenagers buzzing from energy drinks, either Anomia or Big Bazar. What would be a terrible game for teenagers who are buzzing from energy drinks? It would be anything where you'd have to sit down and really think about it. I'd go with something like Caylus. That's pretty dry, isn't it? Caylus 1303, nice simple version. Maybe we'd go with the original version even. But trying to sit them down, teach them a good old dry Euro game, you know, castle building, worker placement. I think they'd hate that. So last one now, kids 4 to 6 years old, and we've got 4 players. Oh, that's going to be a fun session. What would I play with 4 players of 4 to 6 years old? This is easy. I've got so many options for this. I'd go with something like, depends on the ability of the children. Between 4 and 6, the ability could vary a lot. But I might go with something like Too Many Monkeys. If the children were really new to gaming, and you know, that's a great little game that sort of pretends it's a game, right? You go through the sequence, nothing, doesn't matter what you do, but it feels like you're playing a game. Sleeping Queens from Gamewright as well, that's great for this age range, perfect for this age range. A little bit more going on in that one. I might go with something like Monza, the racing game from HABA. That would be fantastic for this age range. Those are all really good options. What would I not play with kids 4 to 6 years old is going to ruin game night. I don't understand the people who put down a big, you know, they stick down Scythe in front of their kids, or boast about the fact their 4-year-old can play Scythe, and you, really? So let's avoid that. Let's try and think of a children's game that is intended for children, but actually isn't any fun. Okay, we'll try and stick to the brief. I mean, I love children's games, so it's quite hard for me to find one of those. Particularly, I guess we're looking for something that's totally random and just a bit boring, like you know, Snakes and Ladders, Candyland, those sorts of things. They're going to get pretty tedious pretty quickly. You could imagine playing something like Snap, you know, getting a bit tedious after a period of time. Maybe that's a bit of an obvious answer, but I think that probably is what a lot of kids aged 4 to 6 year olds are being taught by their parents, when there's this whole world of other things. You know, can you imagine teaching them Monza or Gigamons? I love Gigamons. Gigamons is amazing, and it scales. It's great for adults as well, but you can play a nice simplified memory game just with your kids. Turtle Splash, similar. Maybe it's a little tricky, the flicking bit of it, but it's such a great game for kids. Moonlight Castle, Diego Drachenzahn. These are fantastic games for that sort of age range, so there's no reason to be playing Snakes and Ladders or Candyland, I would say. Not that Candyland is a big thing in the UK. We don't see much Candyland around here like I know the Americans do. So there we go, there is our 10 games for today. We have made 10 game nights and we have ruined 10 game nights. If you'd like to see more of this series, and there's no guarantee that we're going to be doing it again, you might hate it, let me know and give me more examples so I can build up that deck. I've already got a pretty nice selection of cards here, which, you know, so there are a bunch that we still haven't covered between the cards that I've come up with myself and the other suggestions that people have given me so far, but I'd like more, and they can be as silly as you like. So keep them coming, and if this video proves popular, I'll make another one. If you enjoyed it, by the way, and you haven't seen the first edition, go back and watch it. Here's a link. And if you enjoyed the video and you haven't come across the channel before, then there are loads and loads of other videos on this channel you might want to check out, including lots and lots of stuff about game design. That's the main focus of the channel, frankly. Game design, game industry, production, but there are loads of reviews, top 10s. I like to dive into mechanisms. If you're new to the channel, welcome. Please check out the previous videos. Please subscribe, comment, share the video, and I'll see you next time. All the best.